Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome back to our Bible study using the guidebook, How the Bible Actually Works by Dr. Peter Enns, and then also reading significant portions of the Bible itself. Because if you're going to try to understand the Bible, you need to read the Bible, right? Yeah, you all know that by now. We are ready for chapter 7 in our book for today. And man, you talk about some, to me, fascinating stuff. I'm pretty much a history geek anyway, anyhow. And when you add to that, I'm also a Bible geek. When you start studying the history of the Bible, I guess that makes me a super big geek. But I think that there's an important point to tracing all of the history we've got presented in chapter 7. If you will remember last week's session, or the last time we did that, we were talking about this idea in trying to understand what God is like. What is God like? And we recognize a couple of things. The limits of our language is always going to fall far short. We can never comprehend or say everything there is to know and say about God, but language is all we have. And so for every generation and for thousands of years, people of faith in God have told stories and written accounts and have recorded their understandings, their ways of trying to understand who God is and how God relates to God's people. And so we're doing the same thing that the writers of the Bible have done. We're trying to take our language and describe for us and in our experience what God is like. We got to the end of that session last time, and we talked about the fact that it is highly likely that the children of Israel, when we kind of use that term to describe the Jewish people, all the way from their beginnings in the time of Abraham, and you go through the rest of the stories up to Moses, and then you go to people like King David and King Solomon and all the kings and the prophets, and right on up through to the time of Jesus, who was descended from King David and was a Jew born in Israel. All of those folks, and one of the reasons we find differing ideas about God and about how to live for God, one of the reasons we find differing ideas within the Bible itself is that it was written over a long period of time and it was written by different people. And when people would read something that was written 100 or 200 or 300 years earlier, and then they began to talk about God, sometimes they would use different wording and they would describe things in different ways. They would even remember things from the past in different ways. So we're not seeing those as conflicts in the Bible. Our idea has been those are places where we're invited to read the story, consider what it meant, how it was understood in the culture at the time it was written, look at the various differences and in the way those events may be recorded, and to seek the wisdom that comes from the saying we've been using is reading the story and reading the situation. And then we have to do the same thing in our time. So, the curious idea that we pointed out at the end of the chapter last time was this belief by the children of Israel in their time and in their world that we sometimes think that they always believed that there was just one God and that any other God, whether it was an idol or a part of nature or anything else, was just false, that there was nothing to it, that there were no other gods who existed. What we learn from a careful reading is that's not actually true. They did believe that there were other gods. That was the way everybody in their time and in their world believed. What they came to believe was that the God who called out Abraham and the God who blessed the children of Israel so that that God might bless the whole world was the most high God, or the most important God, or, as we're going to see today, the strongest God, the one who was able to rule the world to be the king of the universe, which in um, Hebrew culture is the phrase that is most often used to describe God, the God that we understand to be the God of these Old Testament stories, the God of Jesus, and the God who still loves and watches over us to this day. So we're going to look first at the story that leads us into that idea as a curious line from the Bible about the power of another God that was called upon to oppose the children of Israel in their battle to rule the land that had been promised to them by their God, Yahweh. Now, almost goes without saying, but let's be sure and say it. That same discussion and that same battle is very much alive in our world today. We know that the fighting that's happening currently between Israel, between the groups from Gaza and other groups allied around there in Palestine and in the lands that are close to Israel, they're still fighting over the land. And the idea that God, the great God, would give the land just to the Hebrews and take it away from the Palestinians has been, well, we might say in this day and time, or at least where I grew up, well, them's fighting words. And they've been fighting over the land ever since. So we have a story today in 2 Kings chapter 3, the Bible's book of 2 Kings chapter 3. I'm going to quote just part of the story. I encourage you to read the whole thing. Um, we see that the children of Israel are going to fight in the land of Moab, which is a part of current day Jordan. It's right there by the Jordan River, and it was again a bordering on the promised land. And over the years, Israel, that nation, had kind of taken over and had rule in that what was then the eastern bank of the Jordan, similar to what happens today in the West Bank of the Jordan. We hear about that and the tension that is there. The West Bank of the Jordan River belongs to the Palestinians, but Israel sets the rules. And so, yeah, there's a lot of tension. Well, there was tension back in the Bible's day, too. All of this is going to continue our emphasis of what is God like. So let's hear it from 2 Kings chapter 3. I'm beginning in verse 4. Now, King Mesha of Moab was a sheep breeder who used to deliver to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab, who was the king of Israel, when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. He didn't want to keep bringing all those sheep. He didn't want to pay this tribute, this tax. So King Jehoram marched out of Samaria at that time and mustered the troops from all of Israel. As he went, he sent word to King Jehoshaphat of Judah. Now, we're in the part of Israel's history where it's divided into two nations. The northern part is called Israel. The southern part is called Judah. And so there are two kings. Who did we have? King Jehoram in the north and King Jehoshaphat. Jumping Jehoshaphat, right? In Judah. Here's the message. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to battle against Moab? And he, King Jehoshaphat, answered, I will. I am as you are. My people are your people. My horses are your horses. So again, keep in your mind, this is all Israel in terms of what we consider to be the children of Israel. It's just that part of the kingdom is now called Israel, and the other part is called Judah. But as Jehoshaphat says, your people are my people. We're together in this. Now down to verse 21. When all the Moabites heard that the kings had come to fight against them, all who were able to put on armor, from the youngest to the oldest, were called out and were drawn up at the frontier. Verse 24, but when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and attacked the Moabites, who fled before them. As they entered Moab, they continued the attack. You got it? The Israelites were ready for them. They sprung a trap. Here come the Moabites. Hey, you can't do this to us. And then up jumps Israel and they start fighting and they're winning. And so they chase the Moabites back on the other side of the river, back into their land. And now the troops from Israel are invading. Verse 26. When the king of Moab saw the battle was going against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they could not. That was a lesser king who was helping in the battle. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Now, those last couple of sentences are what we're really interested in. Everything else sets it up for us. The king of Moab took his son, notice, his only son. We get this language a lot in the Bible, and sacrificed him to their God. We know that the name of their God was Chemosh, and I'm going to tell you where that comes from in just a moment. So he made a sacrifice, prayed to their God, and it seems like it worked. Great wrath fell upon Israel, and they were no longer winning the battle, and they had to tuck tail and go back home. So, what's going on here? From the perspective that we might expect in the Bible, where was the God of Israel? Yahweh was his proper name. Where was Yahweh for this battle? Asleep on the job? Didn't care about the people? Just took the day off and said, I'm not going to get involved? I'm being a bit facetious, but, there are bound to be some hard questions asked about this. How did a foreign God get one up here and bless the Moabites with victory on this day? There was an archaeological discovery, Dr. Enns references this in his book, known as the Mesha stone, named after the king, or the Moabite stone. I remember studying this in junior high in history. And it's a complete carving from this time, about 850 years before the time of Christ. It resides to this day in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It's a great archaeological discovery. It was discovered in 1868. And among a few other things, what's written on this stone is the Moabite version, Mesha himself telling the story of what happened that day. And he's the one who describes how Chemosh, the god of Moab, had been angry with his people and had allowed them to become subjects to the kingdom of Israel. But eventually, Chemosh returned and assisted Mesha to throw off the yoke of Israel and to free the lands of Moab. See how it's written from the different perspective? I've often heard people say history is written by the winners. And in this case, Mesha and the Moabites were the winners. And so their interpretation was, Israel ruled us for a long time, but that's because we abandoned the ways of our God. When we repented and came back, our God, Chemosh, came and fought for us and gave us the victory. So, who is this Chemosh? And how does this foreign god, some would say fake God, how does this God get a foothold in this land so close to Israel? And how does this God show up in the pages of the Bible? Well, if you'll go back to the book of 1 Kings, chapter 11, verse 7, you will read this. Then Solomon, who was the king, the son of David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and he built another one for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on a mountain east of Jerusalem. Now, Solomon was considered to be a great king in Israel, but the biggest issue that God had with Solomon was he allowed the worship of these other gods to creep in to the nation of Israel. And so we see how Chemosh and we see how Molech, and there are other gods that are named. We'll do a study on that some other time, are part of the culture. And they're part of the world that the Israelites lived in. And I think we can say they took them pretty seriously. They believed that these other gods were out there. Dr. Enns tells us that the Israelites certainly believed that other gods did exist. And that's the same thing as the belief among all their ancient neighbors. It would be bizarre indeed to think that the Israelites somehow kept a safe distance from this ancient understanding of the gods. And stories like Mesha's sacrifice tell us that they didn't. That's on page 138. If the Israelites believed that other gods existed, they also believed that their God, Yahweh, alone was to be worshiped because he was the best God. In beginning the work of building the temple, King Solomon said this to the people. This is a little bit later in 2 Chronicles, chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. The house that I am about to build will be great, for our God is greater than other gods. But who is able to build him a house, since heaven, even highest heaven, cannot contain him? Who am I to build a house for him, except as a place to make offerings before him? Now that's Solomon a few years later, after he was building temples to Chemosh and Molech and others. Now he's building the temple in Jerusalem to the great God. But notice he does so by referring to God as greater than the other gods. And that's the idea we're kind of keeping in mind here. They understood that the world was filled with other gods. Dr. Enns goes into great detail then to describe another story from Israel's history, and he calls it the primary story of their identity. And that's the story of the Exodus from Egypt. It's written in the Bible's book called Exodus. And he says this is actually a battle between Israel's God, who sent Moses to be his spokesperson, and Egypt's gods. They had many gods. And those gods were often depicted as frogs and cattle and flies and lords and ladies of the river and of birth, new life. Each of the plagues brought on Egypt. And if you may remember, there were 10 of them. Maybe you learned these in Sunday school. If you've never read it, read those opening chapters of the book of Exodus. It's wild. But each one of those plagues that were brought on Egypt corresponds to a deity worshipped by the Egyptians. That's why the land was overrun with frogs. The land was filled with flies. Why the river was turned to blood. And even in the very final plague, when the firstborn among all the Egyptians was struck down, there was that's directly an assault or an affront on the goddess Osiris, who was the goddess of life. So that story is actually a detailed account of God's forces on one side and the gods of Egypt on the other. I just happen to have a really great study on this, and maybe we'll get a chance to do that sometime. Now, this then becomes the background for the opening words of the Ten Commandments, which are found in Exodus chapter 20. So in the first 19 chapters, you've got the story of Moses and then of how he comes back and asks Pharaoh to let the people go. And then you got the 10 plagues, and then they leave and they escape through the Red Sea. And they finally come to the mountain of Sinai, also called the mountain of Horeb, the holy mountain of God. And God calls Moses up to the mountain to get what we now call the Ten Commandments, right? Remember that? Written on stone tablets, all of that. And the very first words that God gives to Moses to give to the people are these: I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. No other gods. And as Dr. Enns notes, the command does not say, now remember, there aren't any other gods out there. Even as God speaks to the people, no other gods. Israel gives their allegiance to this God, the God that has called them above all others. This is how the Israelites imagined their God. They saw God as the best in a world of many gods. And we, as we try to think about God in our time, we are following the lead of these writers of these biblical texts, not by simply reproducing how they imagined God for their time, but by reimagining God for ourselves in our time, which, as we noted in one of the earlier studies, is actually required for understanding and embracing the Christian story. Those first believers in Jesus were called to reimagine some of the things they'd been taught and that they'd read their whole lives from the books they considered to be sacred scripture, their Bible. And so that's this project that we are on. We are continuing to read these stories of the ancient past, excuse me, and to bring them forward into our time and to talk about them in the words that we have to use. There is a lengthy closing section in this chapter, beginning at page 145 and continuing for the next 3 or 4 pages, that talks about the problem of violence that's long been associated with the God depicted in the Old Testament. I've heard from many people, well, the God of the Old Testament is a violent God, but Jesus came to talk about the God of the New Testament, a peaceful and loving God. Well, that's kind of true, but that doesn't tell the whole story. And let's continue, and we'll get to that point. Dr. Enns says, I'm not sure if there is any part of the biblical story that puts the question, what is God like, before us today with more urgency and with more discomfort. You can read, again, a review. He takes 10 main instances in the Old Testament scripture of God choosing or encouraging or actually God in his own self bringing violence on people as the answer for the problems that Israel faced. What we need to understand, or at least that's what we're putting forth, is that the God of the Bible is portrayed in diverse ways. And the problem of divine violence becomes far less of a problem when we remember why some biblical writers portray God violently. They are making sense of God with the ancient vocabulary available to them in their world. This is the world they lived in, and this is why they described God. They imagined God on their side. And if it took a God that would come in and smash the enemy and put them to defeat, then that's how they talked about God. Just like Mesha and the Moabites talked about Chemosh on the day Chemosh caused Israel to turn tail and run back home. I'd like to read the closing paragraph on page 149. This is how this chapter ends for today. And I just don't know a different way to say it. And so I'm going to read. This is Dr. Enns making his personal statement and his summary of how he wants to bring this to a close. Let me say for the record that I don't believe that the God of galaxies, light years, and dark matter fights battles with other gods, or calls heavenly board meetings, or that other gods exist that can effectively be appeased by child sacrifice in order to win local skirmishes. Nor do I believe God passes out violent retribution like he's sowing grass seed. I do believe that the Israelites at some point believed these things about God. They imagined God in the only way that God would make sense to them through the language and the concepts of their time and place. That's what they did. And that's what we do. And that's why it's so important to continue not only to read these stories and understand them in their time, but to use our words and tell our own stories and understand how it is that God relates to us in our time. So we've now begun and gone pretty far into answering the question, what is God like? Now, we're never going to finish that task. We're never going to get all the words to be able to say what God is like. But we're going to continue the work because that's what God's people and that's what the church has been doing for all these hundreds and thousands of years. In our next chapter, we're going to expand thinking about what God is like by bringing Jesus into the equation. Whew, talk about a big change. Talk about reimagining God for your own time and place. What the writers in the Christian scriptures have to say about God is also kind of mind-blowing, but I like it. We will see you next time. I close you out today with a great big woohoo. Bye.